The first thing that hit me wasn't the sound of planes overhead or the thunder of boots marching across broken concrete. It was the smell, sweet, rich, and completely foreign to someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. I was 19 years old, my Wehrmacht uniform torn and stained with mud from the French countryside, and I had just surrendered to American forces near Normandy in the summer of 1944. My name is Hans Mueller, and this is the story of how a single meal changed everything I thought I knew about the world, about my enemies, and about myself. When I raised my hands above my head that day, watching American soldiers approach with their rifles trained on me, I expected to die. The propaganda we'd been fed for years painted these men as ruthless killers who showed no mercy to German soldiers. But as the first GI reached me, something unexpected happened. He didn't shoot. Instead, he looked me up and down, taking in my gaunt frame and hollow cheeks, and said something in English I didn't understand. Then he reached into his pack and handed me a chocolate bar. I stared at it like it was some kind of trick. Chocolate. Real chocolate. I hadn't seen anything like it in months. The soldier, a young man not much older than myself, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, gestured for me to eat it. When I hesitated, he unwrapped it himself and took a bite, showing me it was safe. Only then did I dare to taste it, and the sweetness that flooded my mouth was so intense I nearly wept. The truck ride to the prisoner of war camp was unlike anything I'd imagined. Instead of being beaten or interrogated, we were given water and more food. The American soldiers didn't seem angry or vengeful. They joked among themselves, shared cigarettes, and treated us with a casual indifference that was somehow more unsettling than hatred would have been. Where was the rage we'd been told to expect? Where were the monsters our officers had described? When we arrived at the temporary holding facility, I got my first real look at American abundance. The camp was organized, clean, and well supplied. Rows of canvas tents stretched across a field, with wooden walkways to keep boots out of the mud. There were medical tents, administrative buildings, and what looked like a proper kitchen facility with smoke rising from multiple chimneys. Everything was efficient, orderly, and most shocking of all, there was enough of everything. But it was dinner time that truly shattered my understanding of the world. They lined us up outside a large tent, and one by one, American soldiers filled our metal plates with food. Not the thin gruel or stale bread we'd grown accustomed to in the German army, but real food. Meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread with butter, and portions so large I thought there had been some kind of mistake. I remember standing there holding that plate, feeling its weight in my hands. The soldier serving me, a stocky man with a Brooklyn accent I would later learn to recognize, looked at my expression and chuckled. "First good meal in a while, huh, kid?" he said in broken German. I could only nod, too overwhelmed to speak. That night, as I lay on a real cot with a clean blanket, my stomach fuller than it had been in months, I couldn't sleep. Everything I'd been taught, everything I'd believed about America and Americans, was crumbling around me. These weren't the savage enemies we'd been warned about. They were just men, like us, but men who had enough food to share with their prisoners. The next morning brought more surprises. We were awakened not by shouting or violence, but by the smell of coffee and bacon. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute we'd been drinking. Real bacon, crispy and rich with fat. As we lined up for breakfast, I noticed something that would stay with me forever. The American soldiers were eating the exact same food they were serving us. There was no separate better meal for the guards. We were all eating from the same kitchen, the same supplies. During those first few days, I began to observe everything with new eyes. The American camp was a marvel of organization and efficiency. There were scheduled meal times, work details that weren't punitive but productive, and even recreational activities. Some prisoners played cards or wrote letters home. Others attended informal English lessons taught by soldiers who spoke German. It was during one of these lessons that I met Joe Hoffman, a sergeant from Milwaukee, whose grandparents had immigrated from Bavaria. Joe spoke fluent German and had been assigned as one of the camp interpreters. He was a big man with gentle hands and a laugh that seemed to come from deep in his chest. When he learned I was from a small town near Munich, his eyes lit up. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about that region," he said in perfect German. "Beautiful country." "What did you do before the war?" The question caught me off guard. What did I do before the war? It seemed like a lifetime ago. "I worked on my father's farm," I answered. "We grew wheat and raised dairy cows." Joe nodded thoughtfully. "My family has a farm too back in Wisconsin. Maybe not so different from yours." He paused, studying my face. "Tell me, Hans, what did they tell you about Americans before you came here?" I felt my cheeks burn with shame as I remembered the lies we'd been fed. "They said you were cruel, that you would torture prisoners and execute anyone who surrendered. They said Americans were weak and cowardly, that you only fought because you had superior numbers and equipment." Joe was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled sadly. "And what do you think now?" I looked around the camp, at the well-fed prisoners writing letters to their families, at the American soldiers sharing jokes and cigarettes with men who had been shooting at them just days before. "I think," I said slowly, "that I was lied to about many things. That conversation with Joe opened a door in my mind that I hadn't even realized was closed." Over the following weeks, as we waited for transport to a permanent prisoner of war facility in the United States, I began to question everything I'd been taught. Not just about Americans, but about the war itself, about Germany's role in it, and about the ideology that had led us to this point. The other German prisoners were going through similar transformations, though not all of them welcomed it. Some clung desperately to their old beliefs, insisting that our treatment was just American propaganda, that they were softening us up for some darker purpose. But others, like me, found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about the regime we had served. One evening, as I sat outside my tent watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Joe approached and sat down beside me. We sat in comfortable silence for a while before he spoke. "You know, Hans, my grandfather fought against Germans in the First War. He used to say that wars were fought by young men who had more in common with each other than with the old men who sent them to fight." I thought about that for a long time. Here I was, a 19-year-old farm boy from Bavaria, sitting peacefully next to a 23-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin, and Joe was right. We had everything in common except the uniforms we wore and the flags we'd been told to die for. "Joe," I said finally, "what happens to us now? When the war ends, I mean." He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "That depends on a lot of things, Hans. But I'll tell you this much. America isn't the kind of country that keeps people prisoner forever. When this war ends, you'll have choices to make about your future." Choices. It was a word I hadn't heard in a long time. In the German army there were no choices, only orders. But here, even as a prisoner, I was beginning to understand that choices existed. The choice to learn English, the choice to question what I'd been taught. The choice to see my former enemies as human beings rather than monsters. As summer turned to autumn, word came that we would be transferred to a permanent facility in the United States. The thought of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, of seeing America itself, filled me with a mixture of excitement and terror. What would I find there? Would the abundance I'd witnessed in this small camp extend to an entire nation? And perhaps, most importantly, what kind of man would I become in this new world that was opening up before me? The night before our departure, I wrote a letter to my parents back in Germany. It was heavily censored, of course, but I tried to convey that I was safe and well treated. What I couldn't tell them was how fundamentally I was changing, how every day in American custody was reshaping my understanding of the world. How could I explain that the enemies we'd been taught to hate were showing me more kindness than I'd ever received from my own officers? As I sealed that letter, I realized that the boy who had raised his hands in surrender just a few months ago was already gone. In his place was someone new, someone who had tasted American abundance and found it sweet, someone who had looked into the eyes of his supposed enemies and found only fellow human beings trying to make sense of a senseless war. I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a transformation that would take me further from home than I'd ever imagined possible, and closer to understanding what it truly meant to be human. The ship that carried us across the Atlantic was nothing like the cramped, dangerous U-boats I'd heard about from German naval stories. This was an American transport vessel, and even though we were prisoners, we were treated with the same systematic efficiency I'd come to expect. We had regular meals, medical care, and even access to books and writing materials. During the long days at sea, I spent hours on deck, watching the endless expanse of water and trying to imagine what America would be like. When we finally saw the Statue of Liberty rising from New York Harbor, I understood why so many people had dreamed of coming to this country. Even as a prisoner of war, I felt something stir in my chest at the sight of that massive figure holding her torch high. The other German prisoners crowded around me at the ship's rail, and for a moment we weren't enemies or captives. We were just young men witnessing something magnificent. The train ride from New York to our permanent camp in Kansas gave me my first real look at American abundance. Mile after mile of farmland stretched past our windows, with crops growing in neat rows and cattle grazing in green pastures. The farms were larger than anything I'd seen in Germany, with modern equipment and well-maintained buildings. Even the small towns we passed through looked prosperous, with clean streets and substantial houses. But it was the American people themselves that amazed me most. At every station where our train stopped, civilians gathered to watch us pass. I expected anger, hatred, maybe even violence. Instead, I saw curiosity, and sometimes even sympathy. Children waved from platform benches, while their mothers held them close. Old men in overalls studied us with the same expression farmers use when evaluating livestock, not cruel, just appraising. The prisoner of war camp in Kansas was like a small city. Hundreds of barracks arranged in neat rows, with wide streets between them. There were workshops, a library, a hospital, recreational facilities, and even a small theater where prisoners could put on plays. The whole complex was surrounded by fences and guard towers, but somehow it didn't feel oppressive. It felt organized, purposeful, almost civilized. My first week there, I was assigned to a work detail at a local farm owned by the Thompson family. This was part of a program that allowed prisoners to work outside the camp, helping with labor shortages caused by American men being overseas fighting the war. I was nervous about meeting American civilians face to face, wondering how they would treat a German soldier who had been shooting at their sons and brothers just months before. Robert Thompson was a man in his 50s with weathered hands and kind eyes that reminded me of my own father. His wife, Margaret, was a small woman with greying hair who moved with the quick efficiency of someone who had been managing a farm household for decades. They had 3 children. Their eldest son, Michael, was somewhere in the Pacific fighting the Japanese. Their daughter, Mary, was 18 and helped manage the household. And their youngest, David, was 15 and worked the farm alongside his father. That first morning, as I stood in their farmyard with 2 other German prisoners, Robert Thompson looked us over carefully. Then he did something that surprised me. He extended his hand for a shake. "Welcome to our farm," he said in slow, clear English. We're going to work hard together, but we're going to treat each other with respect. Can you understand that?" Joe Hoffman, who had been transferred to the same camp and was serving as our interpreter, translated the words. But I had understood most of it myself. I had been studying English every evening in the camp library, determined to communicate directly with these Americans who had shown me such unexpected kindness. The work was hard but satisfying. We milked cows before dawn, repaired fences, harvested corn, and helped with dozens of other tasks that kept a farm running. Robert Thompson was a fair but demanding boss, and he quickly learned that I had real experience with farm work. Within a few weeks, he was trusting me with responsibilities that surprised the other prisoners. But it was the meals that continued to amaze me. Every day at noon, Margaret Thompson would ring a bell from the farmhouse porch, and we would all gather around the kitchen table for lunch. Not in a separate building or at a different time from the family, but right there in their home, eating the same food they ate. Fried chicken, fresh vegetables from their garden, homemade bread with butter and jam, and always plenty of milk from their own cows. I remember one particular afternoon when Margaret served apple pie for dessert. I had never tasted anything like it, the sweet apples and flaky crust melting on my tongue. When I complimented her cooking in my broken English, she beamed with pride and cut me an extra slice. "My grandmother's recipe," she said, patting my shoulder like I was one of her own children. "She brought it from Ireland when she was just a girl." That simple gesture, that maternal pat on the shoulder, nearly brought me to tears. When had anyone last touched me with such casual affection? In the German army, physical contact was either violent or completely absent. But here, in this American farmhouse, I was being treated like family. The Thompson family began teaching me English in earnest during those lunch breaks. David, their youngest son, seemed to take particular pleasure in correcting my pronunciation, while Mary would patiently explain idioms and expressions that made no literal sense. Robert would tell stories about farming techniques and local history, speaking slowly so I could follow along. It was during one of these conversations that I learned their eldest son, Michael, was a Marine fighting in the Pacific. Margaret showed me his photograph, a young man in dress blues who looked barely older than myself. The pride in her eyes was unmistakable, but so was the worry. "He's been gone for 2 years now," she said quietly. "We get letters when we can, but you never know." She trailed off, and I understood. Every American family was living with the same uncertainty that German families faced, wondering if their sons would come home from this terrible war. That night, lying in my bunk at the camp, I thought about the strange situation I found myself in. Here I was, a German soldier who had been trained to kill Americans, being fed and cared for by an American family whose own son was fighting against my countrymen on the other side of the world. The irony was almost too much to comprehend. As autumn turned to winter, my English improved dramatically. I could now have real conversations with the Thompson family, and what I learned from them challenged everything I thought I knew about America and Americans. They weren't the weak, decadent people our propaganda had described. They were hard-working, deeply religious, and committed to values like fairness and individual dignity that seemed to guide their every action. Robert Thompson, I learned, had fought in France during the First World War. One evening, as we sat by their fireplace after a long day of work, he told me about his experiences in the trenches. "I killed German soldiers," he said matter-of-factly, looking directly into my eyes. "Young men, probably not much different from you. It was war, and we did what we had to do. But I never forgot that they were human beings with families and dreams, just like us." He paused, stirring the fire with a poker. "That's why we treat you prisoners the way we do. Not because we're weak or naive, but because we remember that underneath the uniform, you're just a young man who got caught up in something bigger than himself." His words hit me like a physical blow. Here was a man who had every reason to hate Germans, whose own son was fighting against my country at that very moment, and yet he was showing me more compassion than my own officers ever had. It was around this time that I began to notice Mary Thompson in a different way. She was a beautiful girl with auburn hair and green eyes that sparkled when she laughed. But more than her physical beauty, I was drawn to her intelligence and kindness. She had graduated from high school that spring and was helping her parents manage the farm while her brother was away. At first, I tried to suppress these feelings. What right did I have, as a German prisoner, to think romantic thoughts about an American girl? But Mary seemed to enjoy our conversations, and I caught her looking at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. One snowy December afternoon, as we worked together in the barn organizing feed supplies, she asked me about my life in Germany. "Do you miss it?" she said, her breath visible in the cold air. "Your home, I mean." I considered the question carefully. "I miss my family," I said finally. "But the Germany I knew, the one I thought I was fighting for, I'm not sure it ever really existed." She studied my face with those intelligent green eyes. "What do you mean?" I struggled to find the right words in English. "We were told many lies about what we were fighting for, about who our enemies were. Coming here, meeting your family, seeing how Americans really live, it has shown me that everything I believed was wrong." Mary was quiet for a moment. Then she did something that changed everything between us. She reached out and touched my hand, just briefly, but the warmth of that contact sent electricity through my entire body. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It must be terrible to discover that everything you trusted was a lie." That touch, that moment of human connection, opened a door in my heart that I had thought was permanently closed. For the first time since my capture, I began to imagine a future that didn't involve returning to Germany when the war ended. What if I could stay here? What if I could build a life in this country that had shown me such unexpected kindness? But even as these thoughts formed in my mind, I knew how impossible they seemed. I was a prisoner of war, a former enemy soldier. What possible future could there be for someone like me in America? And yet, as I looked into Mary Thompson's eyes that snowy afternoon, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, anything was possible in this land of abundance and second chances. The winter of 1944 brought news that would shatter what remained of my old world. During one of our regular educational sessions at the camp, American officers began showing us footage and photographs that they claimed were from German concentration camps. At first, like many of my fellow prisoners, I refused to believe what I was seeing. This had to be propaganda, elaborate fabrications designed to break our morale and turn us against our homeland. The images were horrific beyond comprehension. Skeletal figures behind barbed wire, mass graves, ovens designed for burning human bodies. The American officer conducting the session, a serious man named Captain Williams who spoke fluent German, watched our faces carefully as the projector clicked through slide after slide of evidence. "These photographs were taken by our own combat photographers," he said quietly, "at camps called Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald. Your own German civilians are being forced to tour these facilities and see what was done in their name." I felt sick to my stomach, not just from the images, but from the growing realization that this might actually be true. The details were too specific, too consistent, too documented to be fabricated. But if this was real, what did that make me? What did that make all of us who had worn the German uniform? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the Germany I thought I knew with these horrific revelations. The next morning, I sought out Joe Hoffman, needing to talk to someone I trusted. "Joe," I said, finding him in the camp library where he often worked on administrative tasks, "those photographs yesterday, were they real?" He looked up from his paperwork, and I could see the compassion in his eyes. "Yes, Hans, they were real. I'm sorry you had to see them, but you needed to know the truth about what your government was doing." I slumped into a chair across from him, feeling like the world was collapsing around me. But we didn't know. The regular soldiers, the people in my village, we had no idea this was happening. "I believe you," Joe said gently. "Most Germans probably didn't know the full extent of it, but Hans, not knowing doesn't erase the fact that it happened. The question now is what you're going to do with this knowledge." Over the following weeks, more evidence emerged. Survivor testimonies, detailed documentation, first-hand accounts from American soldiers who had liberated the camps. Each new piece of information was like a hammer blow, destroying whatever remained of my faith in the cause I had fought for. I wasn't the only one struggling with these revelations. The camp was divided between prisoners who accepted the truth and those who clung desperately to denial. Arguments broke out in the barracks, sometimes escalating to fights that had to be broken up by American guards. Some men retreated into themselves, refusing to speak to anyone. Others, like me, began the painful process of rebuilding their understanding of the world from the ground up. It was during this dark period that a letter arrived from home that made everything even more complicated. My mother wrote that our town had been bombed by Allied aircraft, and my younger brother Klaus had been killed in the final weeks of the war, just days before Germany's surrender. He was only 17, conscripted into the Volkssturm in a desperate last-ditch effort to defend the homeland. I read that letter over and over, tears streaming down my face. Klaus had been just a boy when I left for the war, full of the same patriotic fervor that had driven me to enlist. Now he was dead, killed fighting for a regime that had committed unspeakable atrocities. The waste of it all, the senseless tragedy, was overwhelming. That evening, I walked out to the fence line of the camp and stood there for hours, gripping the wire and staring out at the Kansas prairie. The Thompson farm was visible in the distance, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. Here I was, safe and well-fed, while my little brother lay dead in German soil. The guilt was crushing. Joe found me there as the stars were coming out. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me in the darkness. Finally, he spoke. "You got bad news from home." It wasn't a question. Somehow, he had seen it in my face. I told him about Klaus, about the bombing, about the guilt that was eating me alive. "Why am I here, Joe?" I asked. "Why am I safe and fed and treated well while my brother is dead? What kind of justice is that?" Joe was quiet for a long time before answering. "There is no justice in war, Hans, only survival and the choices we make afterward. Your brother's death is a tragedy, but it doesn't mean your life has no value. Maybe the best way to honor his memory is to make sure something like this never happens again." His words planted a seed in my mind that would grow over the coming months. What if my survival, my experience of American kindness and democracy, wasn't just random chance? What if it was an opportunity to be part of something better? Spring brought news that the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, and the Third Reich was no more. The reaction among the prisoners was mixed. Some celebrated the end of the killing, while others mourned the defeat of their homeland. For me, it was a moment of profound confusion. Relief that the dying was over, but uncertainty about what came next. The American authorities began processing prisoners for repatriation to Germany. Forms were distributed, interviews were scheduled, and gradually men began leaving the camp to return to their devastated homeland. But there was also talk of another option, one that seemed almost too good to be true. Some prisoners, those who had demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and posed no security threat, might be allowed to remain in the United States. I thought about this possibility constantly as I continued working at the Thompson farm. The idea of staying in America, of building a life here, was both thrilling and terrifying. But there was another complication that made the decision even more difficult. I was falling in love with Mary Thompson, and I was beginning to suspect that she might have feelings for me as well. Our conversations had grown longer and more personal over the winter months. She told me about her dreams of attending college, something that would have been unusual for a farm girl in Germany, but seemed perfectly natural here. I shared stories about my childhood, my family, and increasingly, my hopes for the future. One warm April afternoon, as we worked together planting vegetables in the family garden, Mary asked me directly about my plans. "Have you decided whether you'll go back to Germany when they release you?" I stopped digging and looked at her, this beautiful, intelligent young woman who had become so important to me. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Germany is my homeland, but it's not the same country I left. Everything I believed about it was wrong." She nodded thoughtfully. "What would you do if you stayed here?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibilities neither of us was quite ready to voice. "I would want to farm," I said finally. "Maybe start small, work my way up. This is good land, and I know how to work it." "You'd be starting over completely," she said. "New country, new language, new life. That takes courage." I looked into her green eyes and saw something there that made my heart race. "Some things are worth starting over for," I said quietly. That evening, as I walked back to the camp, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to apply to remain in the United States. It would mean giving up everything I had known, turning my back on my homeland and my family, but I couldn't return to a Germany built on the ashes of such horror. And if I was being honest with myself, I couldn't leave Mary. The application process was complex and uncertain. I needed character references, proof of employment prospects, and most importantly, sponsors who would vouch for my rehabilitation and integration into American society. Robert Thompson, without hesitation, agreed to sponsor me. So did Joe Hoffman, and several other Americans who had gotten to know me during my time as a prisoner. But the most surprising support came from an unexpected source. Captain Williams, the officer who had shown us the concentration camp footage, called me into his office one day for what I thought would be a routine interview. "I've been watching you, Mueller," he said, studying my file. "Your English has improved dramatically, your work reports are excellent, and everyone who knows you speaks highly of your character. But I need to ask you something directly. Do you understand and accept the full truth about what Nazi Germany did?" I met his eyes steadily. "Yes, sir. I understand that my country committed terrible crimes. I understand that I served a regime that murdered innocent people. I can never undo that, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to be better than the man I was when I wore that uniform." He nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. I'm going to recommend your application for approval. America needs people who understand the cost of hatred and are committed to something better." As summer arrived, bringing with it the possibility of a new life, I found myself caught between hope and fear. The paperwork was progressing, but there were no guarantees. And even if I was allowed to stay, what kind of future could I really have here? Would Americans ever truly accept a former German soldier? Would Mary's feelings for me survive the social pressure of being involved with a former enemy? These questions weighed on my mind as I continued working at the Thompson farm, learning more about American agriculture and American values with each passing day. The abundance that had first shocked me was becoming normal, but I never lost my appreciation for it. Every meal, every kindness, every moment of ordinary human dignity was a gift I had never expected to receive. One evening in late June, as Mary and I sat on the farmhouse porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness, she turned to me with a serious expression. "Hans," she said quietly. "There's something I need to tell you." My heart stopped. Was she about to tell me that whatever had been growing between us was impossible, that her family had decided I was too much of a risk, too much of a reminder of the war that had taken their eldest son to the other side of the world? Instead, she reached over and took my hand in hers, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that was both innocent and revolutionary. "I don't care what uniform you used to wear," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I care about the man you are now and the man you're becoming. If you stay in America, if you build a life here, I want to be part of it." In that moment, sitting on an American farmhouse porch with this extraordinary woman's hand in mine, I understood that I had found something worth fighting for, not a flag or an ideology or a piece of territory, but love, family, and the chance to build something good from the ashes of something terrible. The boy who had surrendered in France was truly gone now, replaced by a man who understood that home wasn't a place you were born, but a place where you chose to plant your roots and grow into the person you were meant to be. The approval came on a hot July morning in 1946. Joe Hoffman found me in the camp workshop where I was repairing farm equipment and handed me an official-looking envelope with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "Congratulations, Hans," he said. "You're about to become an American." My hands shook as I opened the letter. The bureaucratic language was formal and cold, but the meaning was clear. My application to remain in the United States had been approved. I was being released from prisoner of war status and granted permission to stay as a displaced person with the opportunity to apply for permanent residency. I read the letter 3 times before the reality sank in. I was free. Not just free from the camp, but free to build whatever life I could imagine in this country that had shown me such unexpected mercy. That afternoon, I walked to the Thompson farm as a free man for the first time. Robert was in the barn, and when I showed him the letter, he did something that surprised me. He pulled me into a bear hug, slapping my back like I was his own son. "Welcome to America, Hans," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now let's talk about your future." Lyle, over dinner that night, the Thompson family helped me plan my next steps. I had some money saved from my work at the farm, enough to rent a small room in town and start looking for permanent employment. Robert offered to help me find work with other farmers in the area, and Margaret insisted on giving me some of their household items to help me get started. But it was Mary's reaction that meant the most to me. When her parents stepped away to discuss practical matters, she took my hands in hers and looked directly into my eyes. "Are you scared?" she asked. I nodded honestly, terrified. Everything I've known for the past 2 years has been structured, organized, decided for me. Now I have to figure out how to be an American, how to build a life from nothing. She smiled, and in that smile I saw my future. "You won't be building it from nothing, Hans. You'll be building it with people who care about you." The transition to civilian life was harder than I had expected. My first apartment was a tiny room above a hardware store in town, with a single window that looked out onto Main Street. After 2 years of communal living in the camp, the solitude was overwhelming. Some nights I lay awake listening to the sounds of this American town, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. The work was good, though. Robert had connected me with several local farmers who needed experienced help, and word spread quickly that the German prisoner who had worked at the Thompson place was reliable and skilled. Within a few months, I was managing a small crew of seasonal workers and earning enough money to think about renting a better place. But it was the social challenges that proved most difficult. Not everyone in town was as accepting as the Thompson family. Some people crossed the street when they saw me coming. Others made pointed comments about Nazis, loud enough for me to hear. A few local men, particularly those who had lost family members in the war, made it clear that I wasn't welcome in certain establishments. The worst incident happened on a Saturday evening in September. I was walking Mary home from a church social when 3 men stepped out of an alley and blocked our path. I recognized them as brothers, whose cousin had been killed in the Battle of the Bulge. "Well, well," the eldest one said, his words slurred with alcohol. "If it isn't the Nazi and his American girlfriend?" Mary stepped closer to me, her chin raised defiantly. "His name is Hans, Tom Bradley, and he's done more honest work in this town than you have all year." "Don't you defend him, Mary," Tom snarled. "My cousin died fighting his kind. What gives him the right to come here and take our jobs, court our women?" I felt the old anger rising in my chest, the same rage that had sustained me through basic training and combat. But then I remembered Robert Thompson's words about choosing who you wanted to be, and I forced myself to remain calm. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said quietly. "I lost family in the war too. But we can't bring them back by hating each other." Tom stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You don't get to talk about loss, Nazi. You don't get to—" "That's enough!" The voice came from behind us, and I turned to see Sheriff Morrison approaching with his hand resting on his gun belt. "Tom, you and your brothers get on home. Now!" The confrontation ended without violence, but it shook me deeply. As Mary and I continued walking, she slipped her hand into mine. "Don't let them get to you," she said firmly. "There will always be people who can't see past the uniform you used to wear. But there are more people in this town who judge you by your actions than by your past." She was right, but it was still hard. Every day brought small reminders that I was different, that I was starting from a place of suspicion and had to earn acceptance that others took for granted. But gradually, as months passed and I continued to work hard and contribute to the community, attitudes began to shift. The turning point came in November when the Hendricks farm caught fire. I was driving past on my way home from work when I saw the flames and smoke. Without thinking, I pulled over and ran toward the burning barn. Inside, I could hear the terrified lowing of trapped cattle. For the next hour, I worked alongside neighbors and volunteer firefighters to save as many animals as possible. The barn was a total loss, but we managed to rescue most of the livestock. When it was over, I was covered in soot and ash. My clothes were ruined, and I had burns on my hands and arms. Old man Hendricks, a veteran of the First World War who had never spoken to me before, approached as I was getting my burns treated by the town doctor. "Son," he said, extending a weathered hand, "any man who'll risk his life to save another man's cattle is all right by me. Thank you." Word of that night spread through the town, and something shifted in how people saw me. I wasn't just the German prisoner anymore. I was Hans, the man who had run into a burning barn to save animals that weren't even his. By Christmas of 1946, Mary and I were openly courting, with her parents' full blessing. I had moved to a better apartment and was managing my own small farm operation, leasing land from Robert Thompson and 2 other local farmers. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time since leaving Germany, I felt like I was building something that belonged to me. It was on New Year's Eve, as we stood on the Thompsons' front porch watching fireworks light up the Kansas sky, that I asked Mary to marry me. I didn't have a ring yet, couldn't afford anything fancy, but I couldn't wait any longer to make my intentions clear. "Mary," I said, taking her hands in mine, "I know I'm not what anyone would have chosen for you. I'm a former enemy soldier with no family here, no inheritance, nothing but my willingness to work and my love for you. But if you'll have me, I promise to spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of the chance you and your family have given me." She was quiet for so long that I began to panic, wondering if I had misread her feelings, if I had presumed too much. Then she smiled, and in that smile was all the answer I needed. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course, yes. We'll We were married in the spring of 1947, in a simple ceremony at the local Methodist church. Joe Hoffman served as my best man, having been discharged from the army and returned to Wisconsin. Robert Thompson walked Mary down the aisle, and Margaret cried tears of joy as if I were her own son. Not everyone in town approved. Some families stayed away from the wedding, and there were whispered conversations about whether it was appropriate for an American girl to marry a former German soldier. But the church was full enough, with friends and neighbors who had come to know me as a man rather than as a symbol of a defeated enemy. Our first home was a small farmhouse on the land I was leasing from Robert. It wasn't much, just 4 rooms and a kitchen, but it was ours. Mary threw herself into making it a home, sewing curtains, planting a garden, and filling the rooms with the warmth and laughter that seemed to follow her everywhere. That first year of marriage was the happiest of my life. We worked side by side, building our farm operation and our life together. Mary proved to be as capable a farmer as she was beautiful, and together we managed to turn a profit even in our first season. In the evenings, we would sit on our front porch and plan for the future. We talked about expanding the farm, about the children we hoped to have, about the life we were building together in this country that had given us both a second chance. But it was a letter that arrived in the fall of 1947 that reminded me that my past would never be completely behind me. It was from my mother in Germany, the first communication I had received from home since my decision to stay in America. The letter was heartbreaking. She wrote about the devastation of post-war Germany, about the struggle to find food and shelter, about the shame and guilt that hung over the entire nation. She begged me to come home, to help rebuild our family and our country. "We need you here, Hans," she wrote. "Germany needs her sons to come home and help heal the wounds of this terrible war. How can you abandon your homeland in its darkest hour?" I read that letter over and over, feeling the weight of guilt and obligation pressing down on me. Mary found me sitting at our kitchen table with tears in my eyes, and when I showed her the letter, she sat down beside me and took my hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked gently. I struggled to find the words. She's right, in a way. Germany is my homeland. My family is there, and they're suffering. Maybe I have a responsibility to go back and help. Mary was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. "Hans, you can't rebuild Germany by going back to the ashes, but you can honor your heritage by building something good here, by raising children who understand both where they came from and what they can become." Her words crystallized something I had been feeling but couldn't articulate. My responsibility wasn't to return to a Germany that no longer existed, but to create something new and better in the place where I had been given a chance to start over. That night, I wrote a letter back to my mother. I told her about my life in America, about Mary, about the farm we were building together. I sent money as much as I could afford and promised to send more regularly. But I also told her that my home was here now, that I was building something that honored the best of what Germany could have been, while embracing the promise of what America offered. It was one of the hardest letters I ever wrote, but it was also the moment I truly became an American. Not because I rejected my German heritage, but because I chose to plant my roots in soil that had shown me what was possible when people chose hope over hatred, inclusion over exclusion, forgiveness over revenge. Our first child was born in the spring of 1948, a healthy baby boy we named Robert after Mary's father. Holding my son for the first time, looking into his tiny face that was a perfect blend of his mother's features and my own, I understood what it truly meant to have a future. This child would never know the weight of a uniform or the taste of propaganda. He would grow up American, free to choose his own path, his own beliefs, his own destiny. The years that followed were filled with the ordinary miracles of family life. Our farm prospered, and we were able to purchase the land we had been leasing. 2 more children followed Robert, a daughter we named Margaret after Mary's mother, and another son we called David. Our little farmhouse grew with additions and improvements, becoming the kind of home I had dreamed of as a boy in Germany, but never thought I would actually have. By 1955, I had become a naturalized American citizen, standing in a courthouse in Kansas and swearing allegiance to the flag that had once been my enemy's banner. Joe Hoffman drove down from Wisconsin for the ceremony, and the Thompson family filled the front row, cheering when the judge pronounced me officially American. That night we celebrated with a barbecue at our farm, and as I looked around at the faces of friends and neighbors who had become family, I marveled at the journey that had brought me to this moment. The 1960s brought changes that tested my faith in my adopted country. The civil rights movement forced America to confront its own contradictions about equality and justice, and I found myself thinking often about the parallels between the hatred I had witnessed in Nazi Germany and the prejudice I saw directed at black Americans. When the local school board debated integration, I spoke at a town meeting, drawing on my own experience as an outsider who had been given a chance. "I came to this country as an enemy," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. "I was given the opportunity to prove that I could be something better than what I had been. How can we deny that same opportunity to our fellow Americans based on the color of their skin?" Not everyone appreciated my words, but enough people listened that the integration proceeded peacefully. It was one of many moments when I realized that becoming American meant more than just changing citizenship. It meant actively participating in the ongoing struggle to make the country live up to its highest ideals. The Vietnam War brought different challenges. My eldest son Robert was drafted in 1968, and the irony wasn't lost on me that my boy, the son of a former German soldier, was now wearing an American uniform and heading to war. The night before he left, we sat on the same porch where I had proposed to his mother 20 years earlier. "Are you proud of me, Dad?" he asked, using the English word that had taken me years to feel I deserved. "I'm proud of the man you've become," I told him, "but I pray every day that you'll come home safe and that this war will end soon." He did come home, thank God, though like many veterans, he carried invisible wounds that took years to heal. Having lived through my own war, I understood his struggle in ways that perhaps other fathers couldn't. We spent many evenings talking about the weight of duty, the cost of conflict, and the challenge of building a peaceful life after experiencing violence. As the 1970s arrived, I began receiving invitations to speak at schools and community groups about my experiences. The story of the German prisoner who became an American farmer seemed to resonate with people, especially during a time when the country was questioning its role in the world and its treatment of former enemies. I always began these talks the same way, with the memory of that first meal in the American prison camp. "I had never seen so much food in my life," I would tell audiences of students and adults. But what amazed me even more than the abundance was the fact that my captors shared it with me. That single act of generosity changed everything I thought I knew about America and Americans. In 1976, during America's bicentennial celebration, I was invited to participate in a special ceremony honoring immigrants and naturalized citizens. Standing on a platform in our county courthouse square, looking out at a crowd that included my children and grandchildren, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment. 32 years ago, I said into the microphone, I was a 19-year-old German soldier who believed everything his government told him about America and Americans. I thought you were weak, decadent, and cruel. I was wrong about everything except your strength, which comes not from weapons or wealth, but from your willingness to give people second chances. The 1980s brought the bittersweet experience of watching my children leave home to build their own lives, Robert became a teacher, Margaret a nurse, and David took over much of the farm operation. They all married and had children of their own, giving Mary and me the joy of being grandparents to a new generation of Americans who carried both German and Irish heritage in their blood. It was during this time that I began corresponding with other German prisoners of war who had remained in America. We formed an informal network, sharing stories and supporting each other through the unique challenges of our shared experience. Many had stories similar to mine, tales of American kindness that had transformed enemies into citizens. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and Germany began the process of reunification, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of me rejoiced that the country of my birth was finally healing from the wounds of war and division, but I also felt a deep satisfaction that I had chosen correctly all those years ago. The Germany that emerged from reunification was a different country than the one I had left, just as I was a different man than the boy who had raised his hands in surrender in 1944. Mary and I celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary in 1997, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends who had become family over the decades. As we danced to the same song we had chosen for our wedding, I marveled at the life we had built together. The scared German prisoner and the Kansas farm girl had created something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of love to transcend the boundaries that divide us. The new millennium brought the inevitable challenges of aging. Mary's health began to decline, and I found myself in the role of caregiver for the woman who had given me everything. Even as her memory faded, she would sometimes look at me with perfect clarity and say, "I'm so glad you stayed, Hans. I'm so glad you chose us." She passed away peacefully in 2003, surrounded by our children and grandchildren. At her funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives she had touched, and I realized that her legacy was as much a part of my American story as my own transformation had been. Now, as I sit here at 85 years old, looking out over the farm that has been my life's work, I think about the incredible journey that brought me to this moment. The scared boy who surrendered in France could never have imagined the life that awaited him in America. The abundance that first shocked me has become the foundation for a family legacy that will continue for generations. My great-grandchildren play in the same yard where their grandparents learned to walk, speaking English with Kansas accents, completely American in a way that still amazes me. They know the story of their German great-grandfather, but to them it's just family history, no more remarkable than any other immigrant tale. Last month, I was invited to speak at the local high school's Veterans Day assembly. As I looked out at those young faces, I thought about all the lessons my journey had taught me, about the danger of believing propaganda over personal experience, about the power of kindness to transform enemies into friends, about the importance of giving people second chances to become better than they were. The greatest gift America gave me, I told those students, wasn't citizenship or prosperity or even freedom. It was the chance to choose who I wanted to be, rather than being trapped by who I had been. After the assembly, a young man approached me, a recent immigrant from Somalia who was struggling to fit in at school. "Mr. Mueller," he said, "do you think America will give me the same chance it gave you?" I looked into his hopeful eyes and saw myself at 19, scared and uncertain, but willing to work for a better future. "Son," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder, "America doesn't give you chances. America gives you the opportunity to create your own chances. The rest is up to you." That conversation reminded me why I continue to tell my story, even at my age. Because in a world that often seems divided by hatred and fear, people need to remember that transformation is possible, that enemies can become friends, that love can triumph over prejudice. The boy who was shocked by American abundance became a man who understood that the greatest abundance America offers isn't material wealth, but the wealth of possibility, the chance to start over, to build something better, to choose hope over hatred. If you've listened to my story and found something in it that speaks to you, I hope you'll share it with others. In these times, when it's easy to see differences as divisions, we need to remember that our shared humanity is stronger than the things that separate us. We need to remember that a single act of kindness, like sharing a meal with a hungry enemy, can change the course of a life and ripple outward to touch generations. My name is Hans Mueller, and I'm proud to be an American. Not because I've forgotten where I came from, but because America taught me that where you're going matters more than where you've been. And if an old German soldier can find redemption and belonging in this great country, then there's hope for anyone willing to embrace the possibility of becoming something better than they were. Thank you for listening to my story. May it remind you that in America, every day is a chance to begin again, and every person deserves the opportunity to prove that they can be more than their past. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.